Hello everyone, welcome to today's video. In this video we will be talking about exception handling in Java, and we will be explicitly talking about the try catch block. So in my last video we briefly discussed about what an exception is, what is the difference between an exception and an error, as well as the exception hierarchy, and we also discussed about the checked and unchecked exceptions. So in today's video we will be primarily dealing with how do we handle those exceptions. So before we go deeper into this, first let us quickly recapitulate what is an checked exception and what is an unchecked exception. So suppose it through a program. So suppose I have a class which is, let's say, class ABC, and within this let me write down the main method, which is public static void main, and then the string arguments. So within this, let us take the same example which we discussed earlier. So that is, let me create a files input stream object. So file input stream f is equal to new file input stream, and let me consider that I am accessing that particular file from location D drive. Okay, so this is the general code which will be there in the within the main method, and for this I have to import a package which is import java.io.file input stream. Okay, so when I'm trying to do this, this this particular program basically deals with a file which is present in the D drive by the name xyz.txt. Now it might be so that that file is not present in that particular drive at all. So during the compilation stage itself, so when we are trying to compile it, so during the compilation stage itself, it will give us an unreported error, unreported exception, not an error, unreported exception, which is file not found exception, and it will show me the line in which the exception has occurred. Okay, now the problem is, whenever this particular exception is identified, or the compiler indirects or directs that there might be an exception in this particular line, immediately what happens is the program gets terminated there and it no longer executes. Okay, so it no longer executes. That means the execution of the program is stopped abnormally, or the execution of the program is terminated. So, and our program will not compile only, so the program also does not compile. So there is no question that I will be able to execute it successfully. So this is a type of checked exception, where the compiler checks for any type of exception during the compilation stage itself, and it is, if it finds that there is any type of exception which is there, it means that it should terminate the program and it will not allow you to execute or run it. Now this we talked about the checked exception where the compiler can check. Now talking about unchecked exception, so if we have let's say, I'll simply erase this part. So now if we have another piece of code which is let's say here. Okay, so now if, let me comment this, and now if I have another piece of code saying that integer a is equal to 50 and b is equal to 0 comma c, and C I'm trying to print as A divided by B. And then suppose I'm trying to print that system dot out dot println, and I'm trying to print here the value of C. Under this scenario, what happens is, suppose I am compiling the program. So when I'm trying to compile the program will compile fine. Okay, because there is no such logical or no such syntactical error basically in the program, or there is no such exception which is there, or which the compiler could identify. But when we are trying to run this program, it will throw us an exception in this particular line, because 50 divided by 0 is logically not correct. So here I will get an exception. So in this way, this is basically the runtime exception. So here the compiler cannot check whether there is an exception or not, or whether there is an exception which is going to occur during execution or not. Okay, this particular exception can be seen only during the runtime, and hence this is known as the runtime exception. Now what happens basically? Okay, now suppose, let me write it in a different page. So suppose I have this class which is class class ABC, and here I am writing public static void main and then string arguments. So here, now let me write down the code for you so that we can analyze it in a better way. So suppose I have an integer a is equal to 50, b is equal to 0, and c we are trying to load a divided by b, and I am trying to print the value of c here, system.out.println. Okay, and C. So as already discussed, this will give me a runtime exception or a runtime error, because this particular logic is not correct. Now what happens is that whenever there is an exception which is occurring, whichever method under which that particular exception is occurring, in this particular case it is the main method. So this main method would be creating an object. Okay, so this main method would then create an object with 3 different values. So these values are basically exception name, then we have the description, and finally we have the stack trace. So stack trace is basically the line in which the exception has occurred. Okay, and this particular object, once it is created, so this object is created by the method which is basically under which the exception has occurred. Okay, once this exception has object has been created, this is then forwarded to the JVM. Now JVM, what it will do, it will try to check if there is any type of exception handling which has been done explicitly in order to handle these exceptions. Okay, so if there is no such exception handler or exception handling available, then what does JVM do? If there is no such availability of any exception handling code within that program, what JVM does is it will deploy the default exception handler. Okay, it will deploy the default exception handler, and before the default exception handler is deployed, it will abnormally terminate the program. That means we will not be able to execute any further code which is beyond this particular exception, or let's say beyond this particular method where the exception has occurred, or if there are any other lines of code which is there after this method, we will not be able to execute at all. Okay, and this default exception handler, what it will do, it will print the exception which has occurred. Okay, so this, the error which we find in the screen, or the exception which we find in the screen along with the line number, so that is basically printed by the default exception handler if we do not have any exception handling code within it. So, and before this entire process is done, it will abnormally, JVM will abnormally terminate the program, but this is not what we expect. Okay, so we do not want our program to get abnormally terminated, and we want to handle the exception manually. Okay, so let me write it down in a different page. So once the object is created, which comprises of exception name, then let's say description, and finally the stack trace. So once this particular object is created, it is forwarded to the JVM, and JVM will check if there is any exception handling code there. If there is no such availability, so this is for no, so if there is no such availability of exception handlers within the program, then the default exception handler of JVM is deployed, and this default exception handler, what does it do? It prints the object, or it prints the values of the object. So we get the name of the exception which has occurred, and we also get the description along with the line number in which the exception has occurred. Now if we and all of this will be done after abnormally terminating the program. Okay, so this will abnormally terminate the program, okay, so it will not look for any other method which is present there, and any other codes which might be there in that particular program. Now if we do not want, or basically we do not want to abnormally terminate our program, so we generally go for exception handling concept, and we can handle it manually using the try catch block. Okay, so we will go for manual handling of exception. Now here once again I would like to remind that when I'm talking about handling of exception, we do not mean that we are removing that exception altogether. So what we are trying to do, we are just giving an alternative code which will be executed whenever that particular exception is occurred. So we can handle exception basically, so we will talk about this primarily. So manual handling of exceptions, so we can handle the exceptions using 5 different keywords. Okay, 5 keywords for exception handling. So what are these 5 keywords? So these are try, catch, finally, throw, and throws. So these are the 5 different keywords which will be used for exception handling, and today we will be talking about this block, the try catch block. Please remember that whenever we are using the try and catch block, if we are using try, definitely we have to use a catch block with it. So talking about try catch block, so try catch block, first of all let us see how the syntax looks like. Okay, so what we will do is we'll write try, and within the try block we will be writing down the risky code. That means the code which might produce any exception. In this particular example that we have discussed, this is the code which might produce any exception along with this, of course. Yes, so this is the code. That means this part is basically capable of creating exceptions. So hence we will be writing it inside the try block, and after that, as already mentioned, it has to be followed by the catch block. Both of this work hand in hand, and they have to be written together. So here inside the catch block, so before we go inside the catch block, the catch has a parameter which says exception class name, and then we will have a reference variable. Okay, so reference variable basically is capable of holding the object which is created by the main method. Okay, so this particular object that we talked about, so this object, the reference variable, would be able to access or get hold of. So if we are considering the previous example, so let me write it down again. So if we are considering the previous example, that is class ABC public static void main string arguments. So here, if I'm trying to what we are trying to do is, we will try to involve the try block here. So within the try block, we will be writing down the vulnerable code which might produce any exceptions. Okay, C is equal to A by B. So we are having doubts that this might cause some problem, so we will write down the try block here, and within the catch, since try has to be followed by catch, so we will write down the name of the class of exception. Okay, which is, in this case, it is arithmetic exception, and let us write down a give a reference variable. Okay, and within this, let me print the value of E. So E is basically capable of holding the object which the main method would be creating. Okay, so this will be, and E will have all the values associated with the stack trace, that means the line, as well as the description of the exception and the exception class name. And whenever we are printing this, we will get all of this together. Now you have to understand that always it is not possible that we know what type of exception it might have. But since we know already here that arithmetic exception might occur, that is why we have mentioned the exception class name as arithmetic exception. Now, what if you do not know what the exception class is? Okay, if we do not know what the exception class is, we can simply write down exception in place of arithmetic exception, because exception is the parent class of all exceptions, and if I write down only exception here, then also it will work. However, it is always recommended that we use the exception class name if we can anticipate what kind of exception it might be there in the program. Likewise, suppose if I do not know which is the risky code. Now we have discussed that this, I mean, we already know here, because it's a small line of some small lines of code, or very less amount of code here. Okay, less number of lines here. So that is why we could identify, if we have thousands of lines of code, so how we will identify which is the risky part and which is not? If we are not capable of doing that, we can put the entire piece of code within the try block, and then we can use a separate catch block. Okay, catch block or blocks. Now talking about, but it is always recommended that we use try blocks in small or smaller lines of code, because it enhances the program performance. Okay, now as soon as what happens is, whenever the program starts executing, as soon as the exception is found in this particular line, exception is exception is found in this particular line, the program will now not terminate abnormally. Instead, what it will do, it will simply, the control will simply be transferred to the catch block, and here we will print that particular object which has been created, and we will print it in a proper manner, that this is the exception, and that is the description of that particular exception and which line it has occurred, and we can we will be able to come out of that particular program, I mean that particular method, and execute other methods in the program if there are any. If we do not use the catch block, the program will print it, no doubt, because the default exception handler is there, so it will print the value of e, or print the value of the object which has already been created. But we will not be execute other lines of code if there are any in this particular point. Okay, so out of this catch block, if there are any line, or out of this try block, if there are any lines of code which is available, that will not be printed if we do not use the catch block. That means the program will abnormally terminate. However, if we want the normal execution of the program, only that particular method which is throwing the exception might be showing some problems, then we have to use the try and catch block. In that ways, we will be able to uh, handle the exception in a better manner. Okay, and we will also not abnormally terminate the program. Now, instead of this object, you can also print something like system.out.println divide by 0 not possible. So these kind of statements can also be printed instead of simply printing the object which has the exception name, description, and the stack trace. Okay, so instead of printing these values, we can also print these values within the catch block. It is entirely up to us, and the normal execution of the program will start from this point again. However, if we do not use the try and catch block, wherever the exception has occurred, then and there the program will stop, and all these lines of code will not be not be executed. Okay, and there are no question of executing other lines of code after the exception has occurred if we do not handle it manually. So these are certain concepts which are related with the try and catch block, and we have to understand that the flow of try catch block happens in a sequential manner. Now, what do I mean by the flow of the try catch block? Now, suppose the program, the first line execution is this, then it is this, then the second line of execution is this. Okay, and then it will enter the try block. Okay, after that the first line is executed. When it is trying to execute the second line, okay, when it is trying to use execute c is equal to a by b, here the exception has occurred. So once here the exception has occurred, once the exception has occurred here, so now the lines of code which is following uh, the lines of code which is there after this particular exception, okay, within this same method, it will no longer be executed. That means this particular line will not be executed. Instead, the control would be transferred to the catch block, and once the control is transferred to the catch block, the catch block will be executed in a sequential manner. Suppose this line is there, so it will print this line, and it will come out and start executing the next line which is out of this try and catch block. Okay, it might be some other try and catch block, or it might be some different method, so it will go on executing this. But if I do not use this try and catch block, what happens is, whenever the exception is occurred, after this nothing else will execute and the program will terminate. abnormally. So hence, in order to stop the abnormal execution or abnormal termination of the program, we will use try and catch block, and inside the try we will be writing down the risky code, and inside the catch we will be actually mentioning the alternate code which needs to be printed. Okay, always remember that if we are using exception handling, that does not mean that we are ruling out or we are removing the exception. No, we are just providing an alternative way in which the normal execution of the program do not terminate. Only that part which might be having some issues, it will not be executed. The rest of the program will start working fine. So this is all about the try catch block. We will talk about finally throw and throws keyword in my next video. Thank you.